And as we talked about it, we said, well, who might be some people that we may want to have people know more about? Well, Patrick Jackson's name keeps coming up. And I can think of many reasons why his name keeps coming up. But you will find out as he talks to you a little bit more about his journey to where he is now, why this sort of made sense to launch the series with him. And so I'm going to be really brief because the other thing about the series is we want to make it as informal as possible so that, folks can start with setting the groundwork and setting the stage. But then the idea really is to have a conversation with you. So for many here, I know many of you have had him as a professor, so you know certainly what he's like as a professor. Others have had him in different settings, but the one thing you will know about Patrick is that he really, really likes to engage in very substantive, intellectual, sometimes I would say quite heavy stuff. And I told you he would. I knew that he would do that. So let me briefly introduce him. Patrick is currently the Associate Dean for Curriculum and Learning and Professor of International Relations in the School of International Service. He previously taught at Columbia University and NYU. He received his doctorate in political science from Columbia University. And in 2003-2004, he served as president of the International Studies Association Northeast. And in 2012-13, he did so again. He was also the former editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Relations and Development. He was named 2012 U.S. Professor of the Year for the District of Columbia by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. That is truly a major honor. His research is vast. His areas of interest is quite vast, but most specifically around culture and agency, international relations theory, and I know some of you have certainly had him in classes for international relations theory, scientific methodology, the role of rhetoric in public life, civilizations in the world, sociology of academic knowledge. And so it is truly an honor for us to have Patrick sort of launch this series. The other thing that I want to make sure that before you leave here, because your ideas really do matter to us, you will see on your chairs, we gave you a little brief sort of form. And what we're asking you to do is to think about who would you like to hear from? We really want to collect ideas from you and want to be able to bring in folks that you want to hear from. And so we would welcome your ideas and suggestions of other speakers. We plan to launch probably a second What Matters to Me and Why at the end of March. And then we'll be having the series back in the fall. And so without further ado, Patrick, you can get us started. Thanks again for accepting to launch this series for us.
Well, I can start while we're waiting for the slides to show up. So I brought some friends. I brought St. Augustine. I brought Weber, because I never go anywhere without my Weber. I brought Parker Palmer, and I brought Martin Heidegger, as I mentioned, and I'll sort of bring them in as appropriate here, because I was a little unclear as to how to do this, right? This is not a normal kind of activity for an academic. This is not a lecture. That's not kind of what this is supposed to do. So I wasn't quite sure how to approach the talk. So I did two things I didn't want to do, right? I didn't want to try to make an argument for an answer to the question, what matters to me and why, an argument that would try to persuade you that you should also care about those things. So I didn't want to do that. And I didn't want to just stand up here and deliver a creed, these are the things I believe. That if I do that, there's no conversation, because then it's just, I just said stuff, okay, that's the end of the story right there. So that doesn't really invite a conversation in. And if I tried to argue that you should believe the sort of things that I believe, well, that would already presume that we had a certain commonality from which we could have that argument, and I don't want to presume that. So not going to do it. So what am I going to do instead? What I want to do instead is I want to tell you a story. So I want to tell you an autobiographical story in particular. And there's something really weird about autobiographical stories, which I think I first noticed, I think it first became really clear to me when I was teaching Augustine when I was up at Columbia. And you teach, actually it wasn't the class I was in, we didn't teach Confessions, we actually taught Augustine's City of God, but it has the same basic format, where what Augustine is always trying to do in his work is he's trying to point out that after you've had certain kinds of experiences, then the past looks different. So things happen to you, and then you sort of remember them differently, because then things that weren't significant at the time suddenly turn out to be really significant, because then now you can see sort of what the fullness of a particular pattern is like. So like after Augustine goes and has his conversion experience, then Augustine has these marvelously poetic passages at the end of the book, right? So then this is after Augustine has sort of been, he's been a pagan and atheist, and then he becomes Christian, and then he does a whole lot of celebration of this. But then he looks back over things and he says, late have I loved you, beauty so old and so new, late have I loved you. And see, you were within, and I was in the external world and sought you there, and in my unlovely state I plunged into those lovely created things with you made. You were with me, but I was not with you. The lovely things kept me far from you, though if they did not have their existence in you, they had no existence at all. You called and cried out loud and shattered my deafness. You were radiant and resplendent, put flight to my blindness. You were fragrant, and I drew in my breath, and now pant after you. It's very clear that Augustine didn't think that at the time. Augustine only thought that afterwards, right? He then goes back and sort of recollects it, and like, oh, right, that must have been the hidden order of things. I say that by way of caution. Any autobiographical story is going to be told from the perspective of the present and how things now look in terms of the sorts of things that were significant in coming to matter for me. So bear that in mind as we go through the story. Now, in order to talk about the story, this is actually where I do need a picture. Things that looked really insignificant at the time or didn't really seem particularly important turn out in retrospect to be really, really important. And they only become important once you've got to the end of it, right? As T.S. Eliot talks about the whole thing of, we had the experience but missed the meaning. An approach to the meaning restores the experience in a different form. So it's the same basic idea that there's something really creative about memory. Are we getting there? Cool. So, all right. So I'm going to tell you a little autobiographical story. And in order to tell you an autobiographical story about sort of what matters to me, if you want to try to get a sense of what sort of things matter to me now, I want to take a theoretical principle from the main character of the Christian scriptures, this gentleman by the name of Jesus, who once argued, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Which I take as a theoretical principle to suggest that if you want to find out what's important to somebody, you kind of have to watch what they do, what they surround themselves with, what kinds of things in practice, in their behavior, actually come out, right? Asking somebody what's important to them is not necessarily going to get you an honest answer. But watching what they do, watching where their commitments actually are, watching what kinds of sacrifices they make, that's where you really start to see these things. Now, so if you were to walk into my office, which sometimes people do, you would discover some very interesting things. There's some walls, there's some posters up on my wall by my computer. I'm not going to talk about the sorting hat and the bobbleheads for a second, but if you just look at the posters, sort of what I want to call attention to, you would discover, there's a lot of other sort of Star Wars-y artifacts floating around in the office, that if you want to look at sort of where the treasure is, a lot of things in the office seem to refer to what I would argue now is sort of one consistent story, which is a story about not trying too hard to control the flow of events, because where you think you're setting out doesn't always turn out that way. So Mickey over here in Fantasia thinks he knows exactly what he's doing, and if you've seen The Sorcerer's Apprentice, you know how well that goes. And of course Star Wars. Well, goodness gracious, the cute little blonde kid grows up to be Darth Vader. So, too much control is a problem. And so there's sort of cautionary notes about not being so kind of, not trying to be quite so focused on that sort of control of one's life. You see, what I started out to do when I was very young is I set out to be someone who knew a lot of stuff, right? That was kind of my initial inclination. I had a lot of obscure facts at my disposal. I beat everybody except my mother in Trivial Pursuit. That was one of my claims to fame. I was always the teacher's favorite student in every class I ever took, right? I was that kid. What did they call us? They called us gifted and talented, right? So it was that group. That was the kind of student that I was. And so what I knew that what I wanted to do when I grew up was I wanted to have some sort of job where you could know a lot of stuff and talk about it with people. And before Neil deGrasse Tyson was Neil deGrasse Tyson, there was, and the older people in the audience will recognize, this gentleman. my man Carl Sagan, who, Neil deGrasse Tyson just did this recent Cosmos series, and of course that was a remake, and there was an original, and Carl Sagan did the original. Sagan was an astronomer and someone who was very interested in among other things, in questions of extraterrestrial life, but from a really sort of serious astrophysical scientific perspective, and did a series for PBS called Cosmos, and it was the very first series I was ever allowed to stay up past my bedtime to watch because it was on late. But I got to stay up and watch Cosmos. It was hugely important. I was like, you know what, when I grow up, I want to be that guy. I want to know stuff, and I want to walk around and talk to people about how cool those things are. And I wanted that spaceship that he had on Cosmos, the spaceship of the imagination. That thing was awesome, right? Because you could go anywhere with it. Space, time, whatever. It's fantastic stuff. So I was like, yeah, that's what I want to be, right? I want to be that guy who knows these things. And this also fit very well with my other childhood ambition, which was, of course, to grow up to be a Jedi Knight. As many people of my generation wanted to grow up to become Jedi Knights. Some of us, well, I'll talk about the Star Wars paper later. But my point is, why did I think these two sort of fit together? Because my understanding at the time of what it would mean to be a Jedi Knight in our world would be the sort of person who could go out and defeat in single intellectual combat all manner of people that you were opposed to. So knowing lots of things and being able to defeat people in argument, that was like the perfect combination. So what career would be really good for that? Law? Tried that for a little bit, did a really bad summer internship, and I was like, no, actually, I don't really think that's what I want to do. I kind of like this whole professor thing. That works really well, being around academics in undergrad sort of convinced me that, no, that was kind of the place that I wanted to stay. Now, in retrospect, I'll tell you, a lot of my desire to be a know-it-all Jedi Knight, I understand, was coming from a very particular kind of place of fear. A place of, I need to be the smartest person in the room, and I need to prove to all of you that I'm the smartest person in the room by knocking you down left, right, center. Made for a real fun time growing up. But that was what I would do, right? And usually I was able to win most of those combats. So later on, it occurs that it's really coming much more out of kind of a fear-based place. But at the time, I don't think I recognized that, right? It was, all right, this is just who I am. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to sally forth, and I'm going to be the person who knows things and disarms all of the various opponents and so on. Then, grad school. Now, grad school, for people who have not been, PhD comics, man, PhD comics. Everybody in grad school, everybody who's ever been to grad school looks at anything PhD comics does and is like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we've been there. We've totally been there. The thing that one doesn't understand often about graduate school, if you are not in it, is you may go into graduate school having done really well in undergrad thinking, grad school, this is going to be like more undergrad. It's going to be like more intense undergrad on steroids. Yeah, that's what it's going to be like. No, it's not. The reason why it's not is because, and this is something that I never really realized until I was in the middle of it, graduate school, especially PhD training, is not just let's sit around and think great thoughts. It is just as much professional training as any other graduate program, and you are being professionally socialized to be able to work in a certain field of employment. And that field of employment is academia, right? That's what you're supposed to be sort of learning how to do. It's a professional training degree. It is a crash course in how to be an academic. So, right, PhD training is actually not any different than anything else in that sense. There are rules to the game of how to be a PhD student and how to be a successful academic. And the game is about scoring points against opponents, and if you score enough points against opponents, you get published, or you get tenure, or something along those lines, right? So it is a very interesting kind of narrow, combative system that it socializes you into. Now, grad school socializes you, it forms you, it makes you into a certain kind of subject, it makes you care about things, made me care about things that I didn't necessarily care about. I didn't realize until later that I'd been made to care about them, until I got several years out of grad school, which is where the story is going to go, and realized that I was actually spending an awful lot of time worrying about stuff that I didn't really care about. But it's happened sort of subtly, right? The whole environment changes around you. You get incentivized to do things. For instance, probably the best example of this is publication for an academic. Publication for an academic means getting things into really low circulation, highly specialized journals that are really prestigious among very, very small sub-communities, but nobody else has ever heard of before. And nobody else reads. And it's a very weird game, right? All the academics in the room going, yeah, we know exactly how this works. Or the would-be academic, yeah, this is what you're socialized to think. Like in my field, in political science, international studies, we were handed a hierarchy of particular journals. And it was like, the world will go wonderfully for you if you get an article into International Organization. And if you get an article into one of these second-ranked journals, then that's good. And then there's these other ones that we really don't care so much about, and so on. So different academic fields have their own sort of journal hierarchy. And it's not just about the journals, it's also about the people who control those journals and the intellectual networks that surround access to those things, and who you're supposed to interact with at conferences, and what sorts of questions you're supposed to ask, and how you position yourself, and all of these really bizarre, like, interpersonal politics things. And in order to succeed in academia, the lesson that I was given over and over again in graduate school was, these are the rules. This is how you have to play the game. These are the kinds of things that you must do. You've got to figure out, even when shaping your own research, right? What's hot at the moment? What kinds of things are actually being read? What sorts of things are passé and no one does that anymore? So you end up shaping you'd think something that was just really just a personal expression, right, of your own research interest, turn out to be something that's really heavily sociologically formed and influenced in ways that you may not even have been sort of conscious of. And we haven't even gotten into probably the worst set of single combat within modern academia, which is called peer review, which is what happens when you send an article off to a journal and other people attempt to shred your article anonymously because they have the protection of not identifying themselves, so they can say all kinds of nasty stuff, right? So this is a really disheartening process in lots of ways. So you'll notice what I haven't said a word about so far, right? I go to graduate school. The intention is to become an academic. What's missing? That's right, teaching. There's usually no word whatsoever about teaching, and if it is, it's a disparaging word, something along the lines of, don't spend so much time on that because you have to reserve your time for what's really important, which is your publication strategy and getting grants and all of that sort of stuff, right? So there's sort of a move away from thinking about teaching, which is really weird because what you get hired to do is you get hired into these positions at universities where you're confronted with all these students all the time. But nobody sets you up for this. Nobody teaches you how to do that. So all the messages that you receive in graduate school are not about that. It's all, the incentive structures are about my latest book or my latest article and so on and so forth. And so when you do eventually get into the classroom, right, the kind of classroom presence that you know how to have is what you might call the baseball pitcher notion, where your job is to take the argument that you have and control it as much as possible and try to strike out all the objections. Right? So I'm going to deliver a lecture where I'm going to anticipate all the things people are going to say against my points, and I'm going to defeat them all. Right? It's exactly the same thing as you do when you write an article and try to strike out the reviewers. Right? You get 3 strikes on your reviewers and you get published. Right? Yeah. So it's the same basic set of ideas. So a pitcher, particularly a pitcher like my man Mike Mussina over here, who was also incredibly good as a good defensive pitcher, a good person at fielding his position, this is the kind of person that you get formed to be in these sorts of academic settings. And so, of course, you walk into a classroom and you start doing that because that's what you know how to do. Now, that is problematic. And that is problematic in the extreme because what it leads to is it leads to classrooms that look like that, right? It leads to big multimedia presentation of thing, and I'm going to stand up here and pontificate about how awesome I am and so on and so forth. And that becomes the kind of pedagogical model that unless one thinks about really hard, that you end up doing by default, having gone through this academic socialization, right? Carl Sagan behind a lectern, the sage on the stage. That's the kind of thing that you are, by omission, socialized into being in the classroom because no one ever has presented any sort of alternatives. And the only thing people say about teaching, as I said, is don't spend so much time on it, don't waste your time. So I had that model in my head. When I TA'd my first classes in graduate school, and when I taught my first class, which was actually a U.S. foreign policy class, and I've never taught a U.S. foreign policy class ever again after having taught it this once as a graduate student, what did I do? I prepared really detailed notes. I came in, I read them to the class. I defeated all of their various objections, and I impressed everybody with my brilliance. Of course they were impressed. It was in their interest to be impressed, right? Because I was grading them. So what we had, right, what we had in that sort of a lecture situation is we had kind of a closed circuit. Imagine a sort of professor at the top and a bunch of students out here. And what happens? Well, I stand up here and I pontificate. Information is now beamed into all of your heads, and then you spit it back to me on the exam. We call it a very mutually beneficial transaction. I get a salary, you get a credit, we're good. We all kind of go our separate ways. And then this is just sort of the model that then is held in place. Now, I was never super satisfied with this particular model, even as a graduate student. In part because I'd never found this to be a useful style for me as a learner. I was the obnoxious kid here who interrupted the lecture. It was like, what about the following 14 points that refute what you just said? So I'd be the person who was not going to accept defeat in those sort of situations. Or if I didn't want to do direct combat, then you just go and complain about it to your friends afterwards, and you reteach the class on the way out. Oh my God, he should have done this, and he should have that kind of thing. So yes, I was in fact that kid. In part, I was never happy with this model because I found it kind of unfair. Weber in Sciences of Vocation has a really interesting account of this when he's talking about what happens in a lecture hall versus what happens outside of a lecture hall. And I felt in some ways what Weber's getting at here is that it's fairer to do those kinds of things where you're trying to put your opinion over on somebody outside of a lecture hall because of the power inequity in the lecture hall, right? If you speak about democracy at a public meeting, Weber said, there's no need to make a secret of your personal point of view. On the contrary, you have to take one side or the other. Explicitly, that's your duty. The words you use are not the tools of academic analysis, but they're a way of winning others over to your political point of view. They are not plowshares to loosen the solid soil of contemplative thought, but swords to be used against your opponents, weapons, in short. In the lecture room, he goes on to say, it would be an outrage to make use of language in this way. Right? The genuine teacher will take good care not to use his position at the lectern to promote any particular point of view, whether explicitly or by suggestion, for this latter tactic is, of course, the most treacherous approach, when it is done in the guise of, quote, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Because, of course, a skilled lecturer can allow the facts to speak for themselves and lead you right along to whatever position it is that they would actually like you to occupy. And I always kind of felt that was a little bit unfair. And so that I was sort of not happy with the model that way. But also another reason why I was kind of concerned about this particular model is because when I came here, right, when I got a job here at a place where we don't have a lot of large lecture halls, and a place where classes were generally a little bit smaller and students were like literally physically closer to you than they were in big lecture halls at NYU or something. The more and more I found what I actually wanted to do is I wanted to have conversations with students and say, here's a neat thing that I saw, and I want to have a conversation with you about this neat thing. So here's this text, or here's this theoretical problem, or here's this political issue, and let's actually just kind of talk about this. You can't talk in that model. Right? I can broadcast. We can't actually have a conversation about these things. So while I was in graduate school, I actually taught in a program at Columbia, which is called the Contemporary Civilization Program. It is the original Plato to NATO class, the Western Civ course. So you literally start off with Plato and the pre-Socratics, and then you just kind of move right on up. And it was great because you were, well, a graduate student in contemporary civilization got to be what they call a preceptor, which I think is from the Latin for not paid as much as a full faculty member. And then you would have your own section, and you got a control of about a third of the syllabus. 2/3 of the syllabus was common, and then you could kind of innovate around the edges. So, I would look at it and say, okay, we need more Hobbes, so we'll do more Hobbes. Always need more Hobbes. In the spring semester when you got into the more moderns, I was like, you know what, we're not just going to read Nietzsche, we're going to read some Kierkegaard. Yeah, let's do that. So you got a chance to kind of to modify the syllabus in that way. And it was all seminar style, small classes. I was like, oh, there's something different going on here than that model. That's kind of cool. I wonder what that would be like. And I got my job here. And I was, at that point, I think you could say, kind of pulled in these two different directions. There's this particular kind of teaching that I find really engaging, and then there's all these things that I've been socialized to believe are important in graduate school. And then, this is where the sort of magical part of this story happens. And then I kept running into walls with the professional academic part. My articles were not published in top journals. I still have yet to have a single authored journal in a single authored article in a top ranked journal in my field. I probably never will. I took a heck of a time trying to get my dissertation turned into a book. I had like 14 publishers turn me down. I had a variety of obstacles in attempting to play by these rules that I had internalized from the graduate school academic game, right? I also never had a patron. Very important in graduate school sometimes, PhD programs, to have somebody who's connected to resources who can link you up and connect you into things. My dissertation chair wasn't even an international relations guy. He was a historian who did some American politics. Didn't have any idea how to connect me up with major resources. So I never had the prestigious postdoc. I've never earned a grant in my life that allowed me to buy myself out and do lots of research, right? That's never actually happened. So none of all the doors sort of didn't work. So you've got all these professional incentives saying, this is what you're supposed to do. And I'm like, that's not working. What is working? Oh, this teaching thing. This is cool. All right, maybe I should pay more attention to that. And I discovered that I really, 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 really like being in class with students. But this model never felt good, so I stopped doing it. I gave my last actual lecture in a classroom in 2002. And in the first instance, I just started podcasting stuff. So you would sort of use technology to get the lecture part actually out of the classroom, and then you would have more interactive discussions with people. But then what I started doing even more than that was not even podcasting lectures, but just like doing some reading notes for people, and then we would just sit around and talk about the text. So the style that I sort of started doing at Columbia then became much more pronounced in terms of the way that I teach things. I'd have colleagues come and visit my classes, and they would say, nothing's going on. You're not teaching. You're just sitting there while people talk. And I'm like, yeah, and that's really hard. And we're allowing things to emerge from an interactive conversation about issues and the use of the text. So these days, a classroom of mine is more likely to kind of look like that, right? So, because this actually was a couple weeks ago. It's a PhD seminar. You were there, Cameron. So I have the author of the book here, the White World Order, Black Power Politics book. That's Bob Vitalis is up there. Sort of we're Skyping him in there. Ann Tickner, who I'm co-teaching the class with, is out in California, and she's being Skyped in that way. Doctor Who, because of course. And then, so the class is sort of around. But the idea of sort of bringing people into contact with different kinds of texts and different kinds of perspectives, that really became more what I thought we should be doing in the classroom. I then, by chance, happened upon the work of someone who's become incredibly important to my way of thinking about pedagogy, who's Parker Palmer. And Parker Palmer is a great sort of theorist of education and democracy. Wrote this wonderful book called To Know As We Are Known. And I remember reading this actually, 10 years ago now, maybe. It was a while ago. But he described a classroom. He described a hospitable classroom. And the way he described it was like this. The classroom where truth is central will be a place where every stranger and every strange utterance is met with welcome. This may suggest a classroom lacking essential rigor, a place in which questions of true and false, right and wrong are subordinated to making sure that everyone has a nice day. But that would be a false understanding of hospitality. Hospitality is not an end in itself. It is offered for the sake of what it can allow, permit, encourage, and yield. A learning space needs to be hospitable not to make learning painless, but to make the painful things possible, things without which no learning can occur. Things like exposing ignorance, testing tentative hypotheses, challenging false or partial information, and mutual criticism of thought. Each of these is essential to obedience to truth, but none of them can happen in an atmosphere where people feel threatened and judged. And so I read that in Palmer. I was like, that's exactly the kind of class that I want. That's the kind of classroom that I want. And the biggest then shift for me was sort of to go as far down that road as possible, was to really give up the idea that a classroom was supposed to be about covering the material. and that it wasn't about covering material at all, but was instead about sort of working on particular kinds of issues and having civil, complex conversations about things. I finally then, after I'd been here for a couple of years, proposed and managed to push through the university bureaucracy, the class that in some weird sense I think I'd probably always been wanting to teach since I was about 12, which was the science fiction class. Entire class on science fiction and world politics, in which we would be reading science fiction novels and watching films and talking about issues of identity and politics and theory and how they would sort of come out through those things. So, you know, there's a couple Star Trek weeks, but then there's other stuff, right? So I wanted to marry Doria Russell's The Sparrow and Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead, and these were the kind of things I thought, we want to talk about this. When I first proposed it, a number of my colleagues, a number of people here in SIS, a number of people outside of SIS at higher level offices in the university that start with a P and end with Ovost, decided that it was a bad idea for a junior faculty member in School of International Service to be teaching a class with the title that I originally proposed for it, which was the title Social Science Fiction. So they said, no, you can't teach it. And the then director of the honors program here said, yeah, we can work on this. And so I did. So I worked on it really hard. I changed the title and left the rest of the syllabus intact. And I called it Envisioning the Future of World Politics, and somehow that got through. And so I got to teach that class. And the first day, I walked in the room and said, this class is called Envisioning the Future of World Politics because that's what the administration made me call it. Its actual title is Social Science Fiction, and now let's talk about this. And then after I got I offered it a couple times before I got tenure. After I got tenure, then I offered it under its real name because, you know, then you're allowed, right? Then you can just say, psh, you know, then we're just gonna teach it this way. And the greatest thing about that class is that there's no possibility of ever being confused that you're somehow covering the material. Because no, we're reading Heinlein. I mean, it's not like there's material here. What are we doing? We are engaging in discussions about the ways in which fundamental questions about law and order and identity are being conceptualized, and what does it mean to be human? I mean, you read Dune and you start thinking about the sort of political economy of intergalactic travel, and then you say, okay, well, what does that actually mean in terms of thinking about the interplay between cultural and economic factors and how we analyze complex societies and so on. So it has all these great spin-offs, but you're never, ever stuck in the idea of like, there are 3 take-home points from the reading that will be on the exam. Because there won't be an exam, and there aren't 3 take-home points. So it really breaks and frees you from having to do that. Right? So then what I ended up with is more of a way of thinking about teaching in which we move from facts, sort of the knowing that, head knowing, more toward thinking about it in terms of skills, things you do, right? Things you do in the classroom, things you do reading, arguing, making of arguments and things. But even more than that, kind of the judgment aspect, right? How do we actually teach in a way that encourages people to work on judgment, the sort of thing that John Schotter, another theorist I'm hugely fond of, once called knowing from within, the kind of knowing how to go on in a given kind of cultural context, right? So that, how do you work on that? Well, you work on that kind of thing by giving people hypotheticals and having them talk it out. And that's what you can do through a lot of the kinds of classes that I then teach. To use a pair of old words, right, if it's sort of head knowing and hand knowing, then we could talk about the knowing from within as being about spirit or character or something, right? We don't have good scientized words for that, but we have good older words for that from older kinds of traditions. And most of my teaching is then over there. That's what I do for the most part. A little bit of this, mostly that, very few this. Not that I don't have a head full of facts. Not that I still can't defeat most people in single combat when it comes to particular areas that I know an awful lot about. You know, things like Star Wars. One of my students got me that once. The action figure, we actually can have a picture and they can make the head so it becomes you. It's great. So, you know, I get to be Obi-Wan, which was just awesome. You know, I'm very grateful in retrospect that I did not have the kind of early professional success that other people in my cohort did. Because I think there's a very plausible counterfactual universe in which, because I got rewarded for doing those things early, I kept doing that, kept specializing in that, spent as little time as possible on my teaching, did an awful lot of entertaining lectures where nobody learned anything, and just kept moving. I think that there's a plausible alternate universe in which that happened. it didn't. And it didn't happen because I kept running into these walls. Part of the great historical irony here, though, is that after I stopped caring about that sort of stuff, then I actually refound my writing voice, and I actually was able to write things that some people found compelling. And no, they don't get published in the top journals, but they get published. You know, the last book I wrote has been widely adopted for a number of different kinds of PhD programs. I couldn't have written that book 10 years ago because I didn't have my own voice. I was trying to write in this voice that I had been socialized into. So letting go of that stuff, not being able to do that, spending time thinking about teaching, spending time on teaching, you know, in retrospect, I look on that whole thing as a great gift. At the time, it was just painful nonsense that required a lot of screaming. But, you know, in retrospect, I'm like, no, actually, that was a good thing. That was a good thing that I was able to sort of be brought to a position where I would agree with something like, and I'll close with this, this lovely, lovely sentiment that one finds in Heidegger's What is Called Thinking. Teaching is more difficult than learning. Why? Teaching is more difficult than learning because what teaching calls for is this: to let learn. The real teacher, in fact, lets nothing else be learned than learning. His conduct, therefore, often produces the impression that we properly learn nothing from him, if by learning we now suddenly understand merely the procurement of useful information. The teacher is ahead of his apprentices in this alone, that he still has far more to learn than they. He has to learn to let them learn. The teacher must be capable of being more teachable than the apprentices. The teacher is far less assured of his ground than those who learn are of theirs. If the relation between the teacher and the taught is genuine, therefore, there is never a place in it for the authority of the know-it-all or the authoritative sway of the official. It is still an exalted matter, then, to become a teacher, which is something else entirely than becoming a famous professor.
This is your chance
I'm going to leave the Jedi up there because that's just awesome.
to reflect and ask questions and engage.
You know,
Yes, sir.
Parker Palmer talks about visual, the Mobius strip, in which you twist a piece of paper and the inner becomes the outer, and the outer becomes the inner, and it's one long continuous loop.
Yeah.
Talking, I kept thinking about the Mobius strip.
Yeah.
Practice leads to reflection, leads to practice, leads to reflection.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just
I find for myself that part of the reason why I immediately said yes to doing this, well, partially is because Jen asked. And we've worked together for a long time. So I was like, yeah, okay, cool. Jen's doing this thing. Awesome, let's do it. But also because, right, my current day-to-day job is being an administrator, which is not a very reflective profession, right? That you're putting pieces together and you're trying to, why I did that is because I felt like there are so many forces in the world that try to turn our attention away from teaching toward other things that universities can do, that somebody needed to stand up and say, no, curriculum matters, teaching matters, learning matters, that's what we should be doing. So that's kind of the job that I do. But it is not a job that gives an awful lot of time for that kind of insight. These occasions are wonderful for that, because if you don't step back from active practice, it's really hard to reflect on. So there has to be, the reason that the Mobius strip image for me seems always to minimize the disruption involved in sort of switching from side to side. So whereas at least in my personal experience, it's more I'm pulled out of a context and then, oh, now I can kind of reflect on this and sum it up a little bit. It's not sort of a continuous, oh, suddenly I find myself in a different place. It tends to be a little bit more abrupt. I think that may be different for different sorts of people. But certainly that oscillation back and forth between now I'm actively engaged in practice and now I've got an occasion to come back and reflect on that practice. And this is Dewey's model of learning, right? So we do stuff and then we go back and we think about it, systematize it, and we go out and try more stuff and kind of see what happens. The difficulty is that the professional structures that we have set up, they just don't reward that. Right? We don't get rewarded for those kinds of things. Academics get rewarded for publishing. term faculty get rewarded for having high SET scores. I mean, you know, career officers get rewarded for the job statistics that people have, right? So we have these different metrics that we use to measure these things. Nobody gets rewarded for their reflectiveness. And we'd have very little time for that because, of course, you've got to prioritize. There's the thing that's going to directly contribute to my professional network and my professional evaluation and help me get ahead and help me figure things out. And then there's this other thing. I'm going to do that because that's the one that has an immediate short-term rationale. So trying to find and make those sorts of spaces, I find that to be an ongoing challenge, but precisely because it's so necessary. That's why I keep trying to do it. That's why I said this is a great thing to do, because, you know, regardless of what you get out of it, I get a chance to sit back and draw some of this stuff together, and that was really helpful. So.
I wonder if you could just
A good question. I often feel like I'm in IR by complete accident. It had to do with the way that the undergraduate program that I was in was set up. Was a residential interdisciplinary social sciences program, and the thing that I felt the most intellectual attraction to was the political theory group. But the political theory group was all run by a bunch of crazy Straussians, and they called it Justice, Morality, and Constitutional Democracy, and it was like this really kind of heavy proto-neocon-y critique of mass culture and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, I don't really know that's exactly what Aristotle's on about, so maybe that isn't quite the place for me. IR was doing some interesting stuff, and so I was a research assistant and worked for an IR professor, and was kind of interested in, you know, some things about alliances and international politics. And I was like, yeah, all right, that's kind of cool. And then I discovered that there was this thing called IR theory. Ooh, people actually like use theory to talk about these things. Isn't that awesome? Wow, okay, that I could actually like see myself doing. And then, of course, I went to graduate school at Columbia and discovered that IR theory was, you know, hypothesis testing mill, and I was not real happy about that. And so then there was all sorts of problems that way. The issue about disciplines, though, right? I mean, what I've learned over the years from talking to other colleagues is basically the grass is no greener anywhere else. Every discipline is just as bad as every other discipline. It's bad in different ways, right? And so there's particular vernaculars that people are socialized into, but it's always like, oh, well, there's what the mainstream is doing, and it's usually not what we want to do and whatever. Unless you happen to be one of that rare group that's in ascendance at the moment, and then you're like, yeah, this place is great, and we're tolerant, and we respect all sorts of opinions as long as they completely agree with us. And then that star fades, right? So, so I don't know that there's any discipline that's any better. What I've found over the years is for my thinking, I sort of stopped caring about the question of what discipline it fits in. I mean, I speak to an audience that's vaguely in something called international studies that's got a bunch of different disciplinary groups associated with it. But, you know, there was an essay that I once wrote for a volume on contextual political analysis, which is an essay called "The Present as History," and you know, they did it because Charles Tilly asked me to write it. So I was like, all right, cool. So I wrote this, and the examples the main framing example in there is this famous event from some of you may remember from U.S. presidential politics a number of years ago called the Dean Scream. Right? When Howard Dean is sort of screaming about this. And I used that, and that was my example for the way in which something can happen and the meaning of that event can then be recoded by being imploded differently at different times. And so that was my primary example, and then I did a couple other things in there. And I got to the end of the essay and I realized I hadn't done any examples that were at all international. And so I asked the editors, I'm like, is this okay? I mean, shouldn't I be saying, yeah, whatever. You make good points, it's good. I was like, oh, well, okay, though. And it was the first thing I had written since graduate school where I actually felt like I wrote it the way I spoke. So I was like, oh, there's something important there. There's a voice there, which is great. So then when I wrote the Conduct of Inquiry book, which is the philosophy of science book that sort of directed international studies, it's really a philosophy of science kind of intervention, and it really is playing much more in those kinds of literatures. There's some IR stuff in it, but it's not framed by, it doesn't start from the sort of disciplinary context. So for me, it was less about defecting and more about just kind of getting over it. You know, you're in grad school and you're sort of socialized to think you have to care about these things. You do a little bit, but you don't forever, right? You can find other things to care about. Yep. Right. Yeah, it has in a way gotten harder. I mean, when I came out on the market, freshly minted PhD 15 years ago, we weren't in post-recession America where positions were much harder to come by, and institutions hadn't quite figured out how much money they could save by adjunctifying everything. So there were positions around, and so people were actually like getting jobs. I know, seems crazy, doesn't it? But at the time, it was, people were actually getting jobs. The great advantage of the US higher educational system is it is so fracking big, right? There are huge numbers of institutions. And so even if some institutions, and particularly the prestige institutions, are really committed to this publish and perish model, so just do nothing but write and be in high impact, Thompson ISI, citation, yada, 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 all that stuff. There are other institutions which don't care about that quite as much. And again, this varies by discipline and by field, but there are certainly more teaching intensive positions at smaller places. The trick is your advisors don't know what they are because your advisors are focused on the high prestige placements. One thing that I've found to be helpful is not just thinking about one's national conference, but think about regional conferences, because you get contacts that way, networks. Here's this little place that I've never heard of before. They're listing a position. Actually, you know what? Okay, so it's a higher teaching load, of course, but it's a higher teaching load, and they actually care about that. So if one is deliberate, I think you can still kind of find those things, which is not to say don't publish, but don't be as concerned about getting the specific kind of publication that makes you a candidate at a top 20 R1, right? Because that's a different game. And frankly, that's a rigged game, and it's a game that's generally rigged against AU PhDs, because you need to have a certain level of prestige in order to make it onto the short list at any of those places anyway, right? I mean, people who get PhDs from AU do not tend to get hired at Harvard. I mean, that's just because networks, these high prestige places hire from each other, right? And they've done lots of interesting sociological studies about these hiring patterns, and so you can sort of see everybody wants to hire up, nobody wants to hire down. I mean, AU's a good, but we're not an elite school like that. So we're not playing in that particular league. And this is not like European football where you can move up and down in leagues, right? This is more like Major League Baseball where it's like the major leagues and the minor leagues, and that's it. And if you're in the minors, then you're in the minors. But the minors can actually be really cool places to be if one is interested in playing a different game while you're there. So it's there, but it's harder to find. And a lot of it is looking off the beaten path. A lot of it is, there's a great article by Mark Granovetter about 30 years ago about the strength of weak ties, in which he argued that the great thing about information sharing, the people you want to be sharing information with are your acquaintances, not your close friends. Your close friends already know the stuff that you know because you're interacting with them enough and you're similarly positioned enough that you're probably getting. You want acquaintances, That's why regional conferences are really good for that. So the random person you meet at a regional conference, oh, okay, well, you know of this other thing that's over there. Cool, now maybe I can go and apply for something like that. So it's out there, but you have to be sort of deliberate about it, and you have to kind of steel yourself, because your advisors would be like, why are you caring? Why are you trying to do something like this? Because part of their prestige is wrapped up in how good your placement is. So, right, 'cause there's this whole prestige game that's, it's all this sort of self-involuted system where it kind of feeds itself. You know, stepping out of it, it is possible.
Jackson and I have had some previous conversations where learning
Yeah, it's a very good question. There's if you think about the kind of traditional sage on the stage lecture model, then the student's interest in that model is to have as clear and efficient transmission as possible. So there's no question of control, and feedback would be, that wasn't clear, I need that clarified, right? So there's still student involvement, but it's very limited, right? The kind of education that I think, as we move in the chart of mine, if we move, can we go back that way? Yeah. So if we move from here over toward here, then it's less a question, I think, of control and more a question of collaboration. Because clearly, if you think about the Heidegger formulation, right, the faculty member, the teacher, is still in some sense out ahead of the students, because you're still forming and shaping kind of what's going on and opening that space up in various ways. So it's not like there isn't authority there, but it is much more interactive, much more transactive. So I would say the student is more involved in have to be sort of more collaborative in shaping that space. If you're in a lecture hall, you have exactly one job, which is to shut up and not disrupt, right? That's all you need to do. But you know, if you're in a seminar, you got to bring it. You got to work. You got to actually be actively involved as someone in helping to kind of shape that space. So I don't think it doesn't produce like a completely equal collaboration, but it does produce a more collaborative environment, right? If you think about it from that perspective, students are, from a teacher in that sort of situation, they're saying, we want to take advantage of the skills that you have for shaping this kind of space so that we can have these kinds of conversations. So that's what we want you to do, not just tell us things. We want you to be actively involved in shaping this space and making it a safe spot for different things to be put around, and for, you know, having boundaries and showing us where the boundaries are, right? So it's a different role. But there is still, I think, a distinct role for the teacher in that kind of environment.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Please. Unless I have, if I'm talking on preview day to a group of prospective students, and I can show a quick chart of where our students get jobs and what their average earning power is, don't take this wrong, Gihan. That's an easy way for me to communicate a certain value of education to a group of consumers. And it's quick and it's visually appealing, and I think everybody would admit it's probably a little bit misleading as like the way one should go about choosing. It's one vector, it's one data point. Not an unimportant one, but sort of, you know, people are like, oh, we're at the bottom line, I want to see those statistics and I want to kind of just run with that. In order for me to explain the value of the other parts of this chart, I need more than 30 seconds in a cool graphic. I actually need to talk for a few minutes. We actually need to be engaged. In some formats, you can do that. In some formats, it's just so quick you can't. You don't have time. you can't explain to someone what the value of this is, the number of students, the number of parents of prospective students at all levels that I run into who will come into my office and say, we want to know where our kid's going to get a job. And I got to spend a few minutes trying to reorient them to say, actually, that's probably not the question you should be asking. You should be asking, what's your kid going to learn? What kind of experience is your kid going to have here inside and outside of the classroom? Focus on that. But it takes some time to sort of reorient that. So I would phrase it less as economic incentives and more as economic socialization. Right? Economics and the instrumental market version of how we evaluate the value of things has become the vernacular of contemporary society. That's just how we do stuff. And so we reach for these models and we reach for these cost-benefit analyses and these sort of faux quantitative indicators of stuff and kind of throw it around there. That's the sort of mental equipment people bring into the question. Sometimes I will try to disrupt this for undergrads and for prospective undergrads, but I don't do this when admissions can hear me because they get really pissed off when I say things like this. But I say, you know what? Undergraduate education is basically undergraduate education. It's really not all that different. Now, what's different about different institutions are certain very specific signature programs and particular things that they do. Here are ours. But you know what? You're probably going to get a decent undergraduate education at almost any place that you go, so don't make that your main point for decision. And again, admissions goes, wait, no. I've actually found that works better because then students are like, oh, I want to focus on the things that are actually distinctive about the way we do things. Because if you stop that comparison, cost, benefit, value added proposition type calculation, then you actually have the ability to think. But it has to be disruptive because there's something kind of countercultural about saying, no, we should be using different kinds of standards to make these decisions. So.
Last thought, just to add on. Farther over to this side.
Uh-huh.
And then
which is my favorite part of any of these sorts of preview events, is being able to have students who come. And again, and to admissions credit, they understand this. And so what they do when we are doing a lot of our visits out to other places to kind of attract people, then I'm going out there and I'm talking about how awesome the program is and whatever, but we usually send a student. The student comes in, the student talks about the great experience that they've had. So it's not that people don't get this, but I think that what sometimes frustrates me, not about admissions, but about the whole fact that we have to make these cases, is we've got to be fighting against a mode of decision making by which the entire notion of college is actually kind of irrational. Right, because so why would you ever do that? You would do something much quicker. This is the whole, the whole higher education bubble argument, right? There's colleges, we can just sort of marketize them and we can, put things off in online content here and there and you get some skills and some badges and why go to college, right? Let's just go into, you're missing the whole point. Because the whole point is, wow, we're having a conversation about a really complicated novel or film or work of theory or political issue in which suddenly you, for the first time in your life, are being forced to talk civilly to someone who's fundamentally coming from a different place than you are, and you got to figure out how to deal with that person. Wow. You don't get that in internet chat rooms. I mean, that's just not, that's not the way. We've all been in internet chat rooms. We know what those are like. And we know what political campaigning is like because we see it, right? So that certainly doesn't reward any kind of encounter like that. It's the space that we can create. Trying to express the value of that space in financial terms as a value proposition is kind of self-defeating. And to think this is much more about, if I can sit in a room with a group and I can do it for 10 minutes, if we can do a mock class, if I can bring students in to talk about it, that's how we communicate what the value of it is in a way that is sort of beyond price, if that makes sense.
my imagination, or is that entirely incompatible?
Thank you for coming. And I find it fascinating that when the Wonk campaign was test marketed within the university, every single focus group and every single person who had a chance to comment on it said it was a terrible idea. Yeah, I think it is in some ways incompatible with that. But what it's not incompatible with is the idea of what you might call, and this is something we try to do at the master's level, a reflective practitioner. Someone who, instead of simply being the expert who can deliver the facts and just kind of push things off and, you know, I'm a wonk, I know all kinds of things. Instead, it's no, well, let's actually think about the impact of different things that are happening, who are the different stakeholders that are involved, how would we evaluate success in these sorts of circumstances. So there's a way that that third column can be relevant to a kind of professional education in addition to just the kind of broader liberal arts undergrad education. But it would not be wonky. It would be something else. If wonk, at least in my kind of mental universe, is like a synonym for expertise, then yeah, it would be in some ways incompatible with expertise. Because if one actually has this kind of education, I think, as Heidegger nicely summed up, you realize how little you know. You realize how much more complicated it is than you think, and how really wrestling with some of these perennial issues is going to take not just you being the know-it-all, which, to loop back to the beginning, is kind of where, you know, when I was a 5-year-old, I started, right? It was like, that's it. I want to be Carl Sagan. I want to know stuff. And I want to be able to say stuff. Yeah. That's not it. Education, the kind of education I feel like I've had, most of which came after I left school, has been about the inadequacy of that kind of model and the need for something else, which is where I then find myself. Ooh, I hit a chord there.
I know, I'm in trouble.
No, no.
So here's
You want to grab them all together? Or?
I
Yeah.
am going to, because I mean, I think one of the for the space. All 3 questions?
You should do that, yeah.
Thank you, because I have not heard the name Mike so long. And I loved him. He's my favorite
Yeah,
pitcher of
me
the
too.
Yankees.
Me
Like,
too.
I've had his baseball cards.
Oh, yeah.
And I haven't thought about him in so long.
Moose,
Now I'm gonna go to
Moose, yeah. Well, and Moose should totally be in the Hall of Fame if you look at his numbers. I mean, completely. Such a brilliant pitcher. Brilliant pitcher. Yes. You should drop by my office. We should talk more about this.
Who else has their hand up? Put your hand up. Sorry.
Well, my question was, I'm a freshman here, and and also in some classes.
Mm.
In terms of
Yeah. Yeah. No, because there is, once you, the easy thing about this sort of lecture exam model is it's a really easy control situation for the faculty member, because it's really easy to figure out what people are supposed to be doing, and you can sort of incentivize everybody, and it works together really well. Once you kind of take the manacles off, then it becomes a lot more chaotic. And if you're not careful, it can turn into 2 or 3 people just kind of dominating the whole conversation, or one perspective dominating the conversation. There are techniques that one can use. One of my, I'm a big fan of even the small group. Let's break them up into smaller groups and let the smaller groups kind of talk amongst themselves about particular things and kind of bring them back out. One that I always used to use, which I still use sometimes when I'm teaching Machiavelli's The Prince, which I end up teaching in a number of classes, is I walk in the room and I say, okay, so show of hands who basically thinks Machiavelli's right. Usually about half the class is like, yeah, pretty much. I'm like, okay, you all go over here. You other group who thinks Machiavelli's wrong, you go over here. You group who think Machiavelli's wrong, what you're going to do now is you're going to make the case for Machiavelli being correct. You people over here are going to make the case for Machiavelli being wrong, so it's the opposite of the expressed preference. You have 20 minutes, go. and then let people kind of work in the small group to be able to do that, because then it gets more perspectives and focuses people and so on. Or sometimes what I will do, if you get the 2 or 3 people who are dominating the discussion, I'll talk to them after class. Also talk about the responsibility. You know, we are shaping a space here. At the moment, you are taking up a lot of that space. I need your help to help me make that space a little bit more welcoming, more inclusive for other kinds of voices. Can we talk about how we might do that? But all of those require the professor to be kind of actively looking to promote that sort of thing. I think too often what happens is people are like, oh, I'm tired of the whole exam, test, lecture thing, so we're just gonna throw it open. You can't just throw it open. Shaping an open space is really hard. and it takes work, and it doesn't always go properly. Sometimes people just, it's a bad day. People are in the wrong mood or whatever, or something has happened in the world that just disrupts the fragile equilibrium that you had, and so you got to take that seriously. But there are a variety of ways in which one can do that, I think. And certainly with the test thing, I mean, I don't give them. I want people to write essays, and then the essays I'll give comments, and then they'll revise the essays, and we'll keep working on it. Often what I'll do with some of my classes is, here's an essay, I've written it, you've written it, I've given you feedback, I give you a grade. You may revise the essay as many times as you want to during the course of the semester until you get the grade you're comfortable with. But I'm not going to guarantee that you're going to get the grade you think you deserve. I'm going to give you a grade, and I'll regrade it. That's fine. So you want to do it again? You do it again. And you want to do it again? Do it again. And if you're still not, we'll go over it. We'll talk about it. You'll have opportunities to be able to work on this. You can only do that if you've got a small enough class. You can only do that if you've got a reasonable enough workload as a faculty member. So this has lots of implications for how the institution is designed and how we deliver curriculum, right, to get that level of personal interaction. So there are macro issues that are related to this beyond just the goodwill of the individual faculty member.
I love it when things start falling apart, and one of the things that's talking about creating an idea of different assessments.
Yep.
And different
Yep.
Also yesterday I went to a lunch about create inclusive classroom environments for students on the political spectrum. Let's worry about creating a classroom environment that felt really comfortable here in this.
Right.
Maybe you didn't want to raise your hand. I just think you're hitting the head of, rather than worrying about what's the next thing that's going to hit, let's get the basics right, and then maybe.
Right, because then if something does happen, you've got a resilient space. You've got something that is, safe is the wrong word. Safe space is different, right? Safe space is something for your office. Safe space is personal confidential, right? A classroom isn't safe in that sense, right? And the classroom is like, it encourages courage and bravery. So it encourages people to be sort of taking risks. And the knowledge of, if I feel uncomfortable today, I may feel really comfortable tomorrow, and somebody else may feel different than that. I always counted it as a sign of success when people couldn't figure out what my political inclinations were, or if they would say to me, oh, you must be an X because I feel really comfortable, like I can say things in your class. And I'm going, and because it was like that wasn't what was important. It was like, fine. So there was a running rumor for a long time, because I have a bunch of ties with elephants on them, that I was like a closet Republican of some kind. And I was like, okay, I'll let that rumor go. That's fine. You can believe whatever you want to believe. But creating precisely that environment, well, you know what? So today, but then when we talk about this other thing, then maybe other kinds of views are going to come up. The only time I've ever actually had to do something more dramatic than that was right after September 11th. Here was a very strange teaching environment, and people who weren't here don't remember. We had a bomb threat on campus 2 days later, right? So they evacuated the campus. It was really high tense kind of thing right after September 11th. And so I was in my world politics classroom, and the first actual class we had was a week after, because it was a Tuesday class, so a week after September 11th. And about 10 minutes into class, it started to get kind of nasty. We started to get into, you know, you're not being patriotic kind of stuff. And I was like, stop. We're done now. We're not going to have class the rest of the day. Basic categorical rule. We will not impugn one another's loyalty and patriotism. That is not an acceptable thing to do in an academic space. We do not do that. And when you come back on Friday, then we're going to have a conversation about the material, and we're going to keep going. Obviously, terrorism and responses to terrorism became a huge part of the class from then on, but it was much more civil. And the greatest thing that happened in the course of that is this argument about patriotism. There had been this one young woman who was arguing that we should not go out and attack, right? We should refrain from doing this. And her patriotism was being sort of impugned. 3 weeks later, at conversation about something entirely different in class, it sort of got back around, and September 11th would pop up every couple of weeks, or every couple of hours, it would seem. And she started talking about the fact that she was a ballet instructor, right? That she had some little kids who were doing ballet. And one of them was on the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. And it was like, oh, and the people who had been impugning her patriotism before were just like, oh, if anybody has reason to be thinking we should be lashing out, it would be her, and she's not. Wow, that makes me think. If the space hadn't been constructed in that way, it wouldn't have happened, right? I don't take credit for that, but I think that's the kind of thing that can happen in that sort of space. So, you know, being able to create the conditions whereby something like that became a possible breakthrough. Darn it. Where something like that becomes a possible breakthrough. I think that's the kind of inclusion that I generally want to go for.
All agree?